4 years ago now, and he led us through a concert, Hallelujah Chorus, and a lot of memories come back, and the grand Thanksgiving service, which some of you were present, and in fact, you sang under his baton. Um, that's him. See if you can spot him. The very large choir which we had. Let's hope we get back again to that. So we extend a very warm welcome to Joshua as he leads this Lenten talk series. And I've realized that it's much more than just music. He's called it evangelizing the passion. That's the passion of Christ in music and drama. So one thing's for sure, there's never a dull moment with Josh around. So a very warm welcome, Joshua, again. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you, Reverend. Thank you for having me. I'm so glad to see so many familiar faces and familiar names. I had originally hoped to give you more on the Passion play, but it seems the previous gentleman in the series did a fair amount on the Passion play, and so I've chosen to focus a bit on the Oratorio, which I trust none of you will mind at all. The Oratorio being one of our principal forms of experiencing music and drama together. The other being, of course, opera. Now, let me just see, Ravi, if I can share a little bit of a screen, and I can. Let's have a little overture. This is from the Netherlands Bach Society.
Joshua, have you shared the audio? We can't hear the audio. Uh,
Let's try that again, shall we? What's happened with the audio? One moment, please. Well, right, let's try this one more. If everyone would mute, this, I hope, will work on the second try. If not, then we'll do this in silence, and you'll have to cope with my terrible singing. So please, let's none of us have to experience that. Let's try this again. What we have there is the beginning of the St. John Passion by Johann Sebastian Bach, which is someone with whom we are, I think some of us, somewhat familiar. And that is the mature version of one particular school of the oratorio. In this case, it is the peak of the Passion as a form. And I'd like to get into today a little bit about oratorio as a means of music drama and the various streams of oratorio that have brought us to the present day. Before that, I'd like to explore a little bit why and how humans tell stories, because I think it's pertinent to the first part of my title, which is evangelizing. And evangelizing is to tell the news or the story of Christianity as we know it. So perhaps the first thing to ask is, why do humans tell stories? And there's several reasons. One is to build relationships. And this is the role of the common anecdote. If I tell Ravi about a really lovely coffee I had, and he is reminded of an absolutely terrible coffee he had on British Rail, then I have gained some sympathy for him, and he's gained some empathy for me. And we begin to build relationship on which society is founded. On the other hand, there are the types of stories that are so abstracted and rarefied that they come under the technical heading of myth. This does not necessarily mean they're untrue, but those stories are shared in order to communicate essential truths to a given culture, or indeed to all cultures. We are pretty sure, for instance, that the story of the flood with Noah carries both instructions against immoral behavior and a distant memory of the end of the last ice age. So that in the history of that deep memory is also carried admonition on how one should behave today. And it gives reason to participate in a religious tradition, our religious tradition, and to believe the gospel as we hear it. There's some sort of main forms, which I'll recite for you, of storytelling. And they range from the purest form of history to structures such as opera and oratorio. And if you'll forgive me, I'll run them down in what I hope is some degree of brevity. Pure history, as we think of it in the 21st century, has a scientific precision and an objective truth. In pure history, we try to eliminate or combine multiple lenses to get as abstracted a form of truth as we can manage. For instance, there are there's a tradition in the medieval church of what's called a syncretic gospel. The syncretic gospel combines the four gospel accounts and attempts to iron out any differences in an effort to create an absolutely pure history. One of the things the Gospels tell us in so doing is that it's not quite that simple, that the multiple viewpoints and multiple histories of the Gospel exist in some degree of tension in order to instruct us on the nature of salvation and on the nature of human knowledge. Closely related to history, and I'll point out as an aside that many of the early German passions particularly, but also many of the Latin passions are given to us under the title Historia, or history. Closely related to history is storytelling. And I was speaking earlier about the anecdote, which is the smallest form of storytelling. But we know that that sort of storytelling became oral tradition, and on its grandest scale came up as far as the epic poem. So we have things like Homer talking in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Hang on. Yes, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Of the real history of the fall of Troy. And the mythical and moral adventures of Odysseus as he sailed home. Likewise, we have Virgil telling another side of the Trojan War in the Aeneid. That's exists in something very close to the long ago and far away story, which is a flag for a myth told for instruction. Deep truths are communicated in those long ago and far away stories. Sometimes one has to stretch to find the deep truth, such as no man is hurting me when the Cyclops is damaged by Odysseus. In between anecdote and deep history, we have the third person familiar story. This guy I knew went to the bank. In this case, we're talking about something for entertainment or instruction, which both instructs in moral truths and creates the kind of camaraderie that we hope for. That exists between the simple camaraderie of the anecdote and the deep history. Moving away from the purest forms of verbal storytelling, we then have drama. And interesting thing about drama, or the theater as we know it, is multiple actors, multiple voices are used to transmit a single story. You can witness simultaneous experiences as a single arc goes by. One can create empathy with a character who's not necessarily virtuous or easy to love. The Greeks had a theory of catharsis, in which drama was used to act out the things one dared not do in real life, to act out the wrath or the violence or any number of what you might lightly call inappropriate behaviors on the stage, with the notion that this would prevent them from being carried out in real life. The other thing drama does particularly well is it reanimates earlier stories. So in drama, we have Shakespeare as our primal example, and his histories. Now we know that the histories of Henry IV parts 1 and 2 and Henry V are not recorded. They're not exactly true. They're more or less true as Shakespeare knew them. In Henry IV and V, and this is just as a for instance, Shakespeare breathes life into these characters. He animates them, grants the artifact of the story of Henry IV and Henry V some energy which it doesn't carry later. So now we have seen Henry IV, who you might know from your history classes, a bit useless. Then not Henry IV, but Hank, the young prince, bit useless, runs with the wrong crowd. Then we know as Henry V, he's victorious at Agincourt. Shakespeare gives us psychological motivation, fleshes out the character of Hank, fleshes out his cohort, lets us empathize with the decisions made, and then see the victory of character as Henry IV comes into, or rather, as young Hank becomes the king, and watches the growth of ruthlessness and judgment as he becomes one of the great kings of the English people. So we've energized that artifact and given it momentum. This is an important part in the oratorio and in opera, in giving the stories which we know well a new life and a new communication. Closely related to drama is dance. And the interesting thing about dance is that all expression must happen wordlessly. It is an entirely physical language. It is a language which unfolds over a more extended space and time. One can excerpt a line of a play, but in dance, one has to see the whole series of physical gestures to have an idea of what is happening. The structures of language don't interfere with the storytelling. And so illogical things can happen without great clash. I'm thinking of the white and black swan from Swan Lake being two sides of the same person, which is known to the audience because they can see, but watches the conflict described in the story of Swan Lake unfold in one personality. It's a particularly precise use of dance to illustrate psychology. Again, moving from drama in the other direction is song. Basic songs will go from story to expression. So you'll have both X happened and Y, this is how I feel about it. The famous Schubert Erlkönig, which if I had a piano in this apartment, I would play for you, has three characters singing and experiencing the psychological trauma of a ride late at night, the terrifying experience for a child of a ghoul appearing, and the father's useless reassurance that it's just the wind. And so you begin to have possibilities beyond the strictly earnest. You begin to have sarcasm and irony, which are crucial to understand a more detailed picture of human motivation. The other thing that song can do, with a power well beyond many of our other forms, is inculcate a particular story so deeply that the song continues long after the historical facts are forgotten. We all know, ring around a rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. In fact, Agatha Christie used it as the centerpiece of a murder mystery. It's a child's guide to the plague. Ring around the rosy, the ring-shaped rash that formed, bright pink and rose-like. A pocket full of posies. Smells, good smells were thought to prevent the plague from entering the body. And so those dreadful beak masks of plague doctors had pockets stuffed with flowers and lavender and dried herbs so that they would be breathing beautiful things instead of the miasma of the disease. Ashes, ashes. There's two possibilities. It can either be the sneeze, the sinus and cold that come with the beginnings of the plague, or it could be the what was quite common at the time, unusual in European history, that plague bodies were burned, and so ashes were floating in the air. I think it's more likely to be the sneeze. We all fall down, of course, is a reference to everyone dying, made palatable for children. And so in this way, the combination of rhyme and melody with rhythm can continue cultural knowledge in an essential manner long after. I was reminded of this at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, when the extreme transmissibility of the disease made a lot of Westerners hark back to the theory of miasma, which wasn't far wrong, in which noxious odor carried disease. When we begin to combine forms, we come to sort of the maximum and the sober. Opera being the maximum. Opera is for extremes, for primal human experiences informed by primal sound and emotion. It's the first great collaborative medium. Song, drama, dance, special effects, orchestra, sets, lighting. Layers of meaning. Which enable the drama to act on several levels. The first time one sees Madame Butterfly, one may not sympathize with the main character, the title role. But one cannot help but remember the theme which accompanies her throughout the course of the tragedy. that melodic theme sticks in the brain and helps create empathy over time. One of the things about opera is it's a form designed to be consumed again and again. And its expense depends on a repeated customer. In opera, as to some degree in drama, and as to some degree in song, melody can work against text or with it. In opera, you can say what you don't mean. And we start to get further and further into the human psyche. You can have a multiplicity of perspectives. So soprano and tenor meet. Soprano sings an aria of how she's nervous and interested in him. Tenor sings brashly with the other men of gaming, and then on the side releases a tiny bit of the hidden emotional longing. Well, this sounds like a romantic comedy, or the average boy meets girl. But instead of one perspective, we see all three. It happens occasionally in television when the drama break, or in drama where the fourth wall is broken and we address the crowd directly. Opera is particularly suited to tragedy, of course, and comedy, both of which exist at the extremes of human expression and address the most difficult and wonderful areas. Midsummer Night's Dream, in its operatic form, lives out fully the absurdity and you forgive me, I'm searching for the word, the absurdity and the slight fearsomeness of the idea of other spirits living on the world. Finally, we have Oratorio, a form which dances with opera throughout its history, which has an entirely separate origin, into which I'd like to get in the next part of the talk. Oratorio deals with sacred and mythical subjects. It has solemnity and substance. The great difference with Oratorio is that, for the most part, it relies entirely on words and music. The growth and popularity of Oratorio was a result of Lenten and cultural prohibitions against staged music drama. So you could convey as much multi-layered music drama as you liked, so long as there were no costumes and no dancing, because it was Lent, of course. We'll get into that in greater detail. But part of the purpose of oratorio is to deal with solemn subjects. And this is why biblical and mythological stories take up the greatest part of the oratorio repertoire. And of that, probably 95% are biblical. I can think off the top of my head of two non-biblical Handel oratorios out of the dozen or so. And of those two, one is Christian Apocrypha. Not Apocrypha, it's the story of the saints. So we'll get to the history of oratorio in the next bit. But I'd like to very lightly touch on the controversy often felt within the church, which is, do the different modes of expression, varying from strict history through storytelling, drama, dance, song, opera, and oratorio, do they obscure the truth or reveal it? I have a particular view, which won't be a surprise to anyone. I find it reveals and deepens the truth. But I would like to read and share a little bit of Avery Cardinal Dulles, who was a 20th century theologian. Forgive me while I call up his this file. Who was an American Presbyterian family who joined the Roman Catholic Church and found a theology of balance. I'd like to read just a little bit of what, oops, that's the wrong one, that's the wrong one. Of what Dulles had to say. And see if I can't just share that with you. One moment, please. All right, here's a screen share coming to you. I'll read a little bit of it. There we are. If revelation were a collection of eternal and necessary truths concerning God, the soul and immortality, as some rationalists contend, the proper style of theological speech would not differ from that of philosophy. If the stuff of revelation were common historical facts, as positivists seem inclined to think, theology could speak the language of ordinary history. But revelation, and Dulles is speaking particularly of God's revealing himself to humans, has to do with the hidden God and the ways in which he calls man into union with himself. Its doctrine is therefore sacred doctrine, its history sacred history. At every point, the subject matter of theology touches on mystery. And how can mystery be expressed? Unlike historical or abstract truth, mystery cannot be described or positively defined. It can only be evoked. Religious language must contrive to point beyond itself and summon up in some fashion the gracious experience of the mystery with which it deals. And you'll note the very next sentence is, the Bible employs a great variety of literary forms. That's another talk for another day. But we know that we have poetry, proverb, history, story, and even record of dance in the Bible. Now, a little bit of history of the oratorio. The word oratorio comes from the verb orare, which is to pray. And the oratorio itself, as we know it, comes from an order of Catholic priests known as the Oratorians. This was a group of secular priests called together not to form a religious order per se, but to pray together in public. Orare, to pray. And what the Oratorians proposed was that prayer should be frequent and in public, and invite the public in. So in the very beginning, while the sacraments were done in the church, a play or musical entertainment would happen outside the church, in the public square. Usually in the vernacular, in Italian in this case, split into two halves with a sermon in the center. This became, as inevitably happens, with an extremely popular event that's outdoors, inevitably weather began to affect it. And so the Oratorians began to build oratories, or places for prayer and instruction for the public. And I'm just going to show you a photo of the facade of the first oratory. I think it's a Brunelleschi design. Wonderful churchly building. And you'll see Getty Images is trying to sell it to me. This is not very churchly at all, but looks most like, in my book, a theater. I'm about to show you another view of it. Has all the characteristic architectural motifs of the theater. There's a preaching balcony for outside preaching up on the third level. Second level if you're British, third level if you're American. There's a grand entrance for people to come streaming in and plenty of light. In all senses, this is a theater, except that it lacks a stage or set. These grand buildings for preaching more and more became homes for musical entertainments with moral instruction. These were called dialogi, dialogues, or laude, praises. And they began to be sung. So forgive me if I pause for a moment to have something here. Now, in this first iteration, the dialogi sacri, sacred dialogues, covered closely favorite sacred subjects. One of the oldest we know, possibly the oldest, is by the composer Giuseppe Francesco Anerio, and that is not Ravi, our well-known Felice Anerio. This is a priestly and operatic composer. Excuse me. This first sacred dialogue, or early oratorio, is called The Conversion of St. Paul. And it sets up certain archetypes which are inherited from Gregorian chant but will continue to dominate the form of oratorio throughout its history. An ario employs 4 male soloists to tell the story. The evangelist is always a tenor, and then several other soloist characters to inhabit the various roles. Paul, you'll forgive me, Reverend, my brain is not kicking up the name of the deacon who receives Paul after he's blinded.
Ananias?
Yes. So and then I think there's the Roman governor as well. There's three characters plus the evangelist. And then an SATB chorus, which represents at times Roman soldiers, the community of Christian believers, and even angels. In an example taken from Greek drama, in which the chorus sort of functions as everyman and commentary. At this point, these oratorios, which are designed for public consumption, are still very fluid in form. Very early on, we have some dancing, some scenery, some costumes, and a little bit of staging. However, the subject matter is very sacred and solemn, almost always strictly biblical. And we have to remember, of course, that the biblical stories were not known in the same way to a mostly illiterate population. With a great deal of allegory. So you might find time or virtue as characters, as well as members of the classical story. And those characters may be strictly for commentary, or they could be actors in the drama. Increasingly, as the form develops, the effects of a ban on spectacles in Lent, a ban on opera, theater, dance, entertainment, mean that for about 6 weeks a year, particularly in the Italian continent, the only available entertainment in Lent is the oratorio. And so at this point, it begins to build. And there's a steady tension of opera and oratorio which begins. Because as it becomes more popular, more devices are added to bring people in. At this point, I would like to show you some staged oratorio. Now, whoops. We all know, I think, or will know somewhat of the Messiah. Let me preface this. By the time the oratorio hits its maturity and Handel carries it to England, which we'll get into in greater detail, it is so purely a matter of unstaged musical drama in which all the drama, all the story is completely communicated musically without any necessity of costume or staging. That by the point at which the form becomes mature, staging can only work against the story. And in demonstration of this, I would like to give you some of a staged version of Messiah, an oratorio we all know fairly well, I hope. If not, Ravi, I'm coming to do it there. Done by a German choir in 2009, the Arnold Schoenberg Choir. And I think you'll agree with me that at best, this is confusing. I'll give you a few excerpts as we go. You'll forgive me cycling through here. We'll just start at the beginning. So we come into the overture here. Here we go. Until now, we have a fairly standard presentation. Nice Pashmina. You'll forgive me for butting in here. At this point, it seems fairly rational. This is pretty clearly a hospital, a waiting room, possibly for an upcoming birth. And as we go, we begin to get some characters. Obviously a priestly character. We'll bump ahead slightly. And for some reason,
everybody shall be exalted.
So already we have skewed well from the oncoming Messiah. As we get to, you'll forgive me for skimming to where I'm getting, as we get on to the on, we get all sorts of strange
and the Gentiles shall come,
including
unto us the Son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders. And the government shall be upon his shoulders.
choreography to go with the chorus. Now this goes on for some time, and I can always share this with you afterwards. In fact, I will put the link in the notes. It is a particularly interesting staging of Messiah. I don't think it's successful, in short. I think in the end, there's no way to see either the dramatic point that the oops, so sorry. Oops, stop. There we go. Technical difficulties. I don't think there's any way to see the intended dramatic effect, no matter what it was. And it certainly obscures the story of the birth of Christ. Anyhow, carrying on, we'll do a little bit of the developing forms. So we were speaking of the 17th century in which oratorio comes to be. And at that point, we have strictly religious oratorios in Latin in a single act. And then 2-act oratorios in the local language, Oratorio Volgare, noted for their popular appeal. Heinrich Schütz, the great predecessor of Bach, carries this form to Germany with oratorios based on sacred subjects. For instance, the Christmas story or the Easter story, or the Passions, St. Matthew Passion of Schütz. They are in a vernacular language, in this case German. They are still based on those traditions of Gregorian chant. So there's a tenor evangelist, a baritone who sings Peter and Pilate, and a bass who sings Jesus. And then a chorus serves as crowd, both the Hebrew crowd, the crowd of soldiers, or serving as us watching and commenting. From Schütz, it's carried into the 18th century with 2 sort of principal exponents. Handel carries their tradition to England, and Bach continues the tradition in Germany. A word first on Handel. Having been trained in Germany and then spent substantial time in Italy, he carries the form with him to London and becomes the progenitor, the first person to use English. Even at this stage, Handel is pushing the limit of the oratorio, using strategic lighting, backdrops, the occasional scrim, to give a faint sense of drama. For example, the first version of Esther, which is the short version of the story of Esther, is fully staged. And his Italian Resurrection of Christ, which is unrelated as far as I know to Messiah, La Resurrezione, those are both fully staged in their first form. There's an ongoing struggle with Handel between the ecclesiastical and the commercial in his oratorios. Now, when he brings the English language oratorios to London, he establishes a form which will be followed until the present day. The early ones followed the earlier form, 2 acts, 1 act, 2 act. These are Esther and the Triumph of Time and Truth, 1707 and 1708. Biblical or allegorical subjects, relatively small. with interest in his operas waning in the 1720s and 30s, he moves into the oratorio form and creates what we now know as the oratorio in Western music. These are Messiah, Israel in Egypt, Judas Maccabeus, Jephthah, so on and so forth. There's a Joseph and his brethren, which I didn't even know existed, and a Deborah. He's always pushing the limit. Big choir, 4-ish soloists, big orchestra, a biblical tale, mostly with the musical conventions of opera, but refined. These are massively popular. Messiah might be the most popular work of music drama in history. From its first performances in 1750 in Dublin to now, Messiah has never gone out of the repertoire. On the other hand, Bach inherits the German tradition from Schütz, but he remains in Germany his entire life. And Bach thinks opera is silly, whereas, of course, Handel invests much of his career in opera. Bach thinks it's a nice way to get some pretty tunes, but that the subject matter of salvation and resurrection is much more important than the subject matter of love and death. And of course, you know, I leave it up to you to decide which one you prefer. Johann Sebastian Bach will say to his son Friedemann, every time they go to Dresden, oh, let's go hear the pretty tunes, which is as much credence as he'll give opera at the time. There's two portions of the oratorio tradition which he inherits from Schütz, and the small version is called a cantata. The cantata was usually inserted in the church service kind of as a counterpoint to the sermon. So a cantata is, at most you could call it a one-act drama, and it is mostly allegorical. The early Actus Tragicus, which might be the first Bach cantata, opinions are out on this, contains levels of allegory throughout. What I'm going to give you here is just a brief, and I'm sorry, it'll be a very broken preview of that piece, because I think it's important to the later passions. The piece is called Gottes Zeit ist die allerbeste Zeit. God's time is the best time, and talks about death mostly. Let me just give you a few previews here. Let's do another screen share. We begin with an overture. Come on. Wonderfully pastoral music with the addition of recorders. Designed to set the scene of heaven. And then the first chorus, and this is a chorus, discusses the theme of how God's time is the time.
Gottes Zeit, Gottes Zeit ist die allerbeste, ist die allerbeste Zeit.
suggest this to your health. It's a wonderful listen. We then have the alto, who often, or sorry, the tenor, who you remember will have some echoes of the evangelist from earlier works, making a direct plea for God's leadership. And then, of course, the bass, who has resonances with Jesus in the traditional characterization, instructing everyone to prepare their house.
Bestelle dein Haus, bestelle dein Haus, denn du wirst sterben und nicht lebendig bleiben.
The choir continues the theme using the subject of a fugue, and the fugue, of course, is the most law-bound of all musical creation. All right. To underline how the law prescribes that humans must die. Forgive me for using very fragmented examples, but I want to get as much of this across as I can. Against this fugue, which is incredibly bound and tightly wound, the soul pleads with Jesus. Let's see if I can get a little bit of the soul. That is pleading for the return of Jesus before death. And the end of this, which is particularly spectacular, I'm sorry that I have to do this in such an abbreviated manner, hangs the last note on a leading tone unresolved. And leaves it hanging in the air to be resolved.
Heute, heute wirst du mit mir. Heute, heute wirst du mit mir.
In the words of Jesus. So in this tiny, relatively tiny piece, we get sort of the full message of salvation all contained. Let me give you that in the chat as well. Definitely worth a listen. Oops. Now, I know I'm running a little bit on the long side, so I hope you'll forgive me. And I'll just briefly say where we go from there. Besides the cantatas, which serve as a counterpoint to the sermon and a reinforcement of it, the major oratorios, Christmas, Easter, Ascension, explore in great detail over the course of several days the major festivals of the church. On the other hand, the passions become more refined and more dramatic. I'm afraid I can't go deeply into the St. John Passion because, of course, I'm long of speech. But I think it's important to know that every little aspect of psychology is revealed. We get the evangelist nearly desperate. We get Peter insisting his denials, and then the cock crowing in the orchestra. Jesus is surrounded by a halo of sound every time he sings. In short, it is as intensely painted musical drama as is possible. And the role of the congregation within is quite intense. It's likely, it's debated, but it is likely that the congregation would have sung along to hymn tunes that were encased within the Passions, which were evocative of specific doctrines and themes. The key of three flats, which serves both for Jesus' funeral and for the great triumphant chorale predicting the resurrection. Those are the keys of three flats, which represent the Trinity. On the other hand, the congregation will also sing a version of Ah Holy Jesus in four sharps, which is the key of the crucifixion, which of course there are 1, 2, 3, 4 sharp things. There's more and more and more of this, and I can go on about St. Matthew and St. John for such a great time. They faded into relative obscurity fairly quickly because they weren't as popular as Handel's works. I think that's important to know as we talk about evangelizing the Passion, that the purest forms of the Passions disappeared for about 50 years until they were revived by Mendelssohn, who had made his great statements to Oratorio after the form of Handel. Handel's form was carried through in England through Haydn, who continues with the creation and the seasons. Once again, biblical and allegorical. Mendelssohn, being commissioned for a great oratorio once Haydn has died, not only revives the St. Matthew, but also revives Handel's Israel in Egypt. So he's fully synthesized both schools. His Elijah is probably the most satisfying piece of musical drama of its period. And the traditions continue beyond him. The German oratorio, curiously, is the one that most clearly influences Berlioz in his L'Enfance du Christ. Whereas the Handelian tradition and the fusion of Handelian and Bachian traditions established the Requiem as a concert piece. And this is where we get the Mozart Requiem and its operatic flair. From there, we move into the 20th century with Elgar, his two great oratorios, allegorical and sacred, The Dream of Gerontius, about the death of a soul and its dialogue with Jesus, and The Apostles, which is a heroic drama, nearly Wagnerian in its mold. Stravinsky revives the oratorio for Greek myth with Oedipus Rex. Even Schoenberg writes a Moses and Aaron, which is halfway between opera and oratorio. Benjamin Britten fuses all the styles with his War Requiem, a piece I'd love to explore with you at greater length sometime. And with the Cantata Misericordiam, the tale of the Good Samaritan, and some small church operas, which look quite a bit like the early dialogi. These are traditions that continue today with the Mass Reimaginings Project in New York, which fuses the text of the communion service with that of new poems, many of them regarding the ecology, which is particularly on the minds of poets and of thinking people, and tragedies of the last 100 years. It has had the unfortunate effect of diluting the sacred nature of oratorio, as the spreading subject matters have meant that a passion just comes to mean something terrible. So the question is then, where does the oratorio go from here? And that is my question to you and a thing to take. How can we further evangelize the passion and the stories in music? And that's where I will leave you. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
I thank you for this talk that you have done us this day. Interesting journey that you've taken us with. Now I open the time for people to ask questions. If anybody would like to add or ask any questions or clarification, please do. The time is open for them.
Joshua, thank you very much, and if I may also just, I think, thank all the participants, because I think it's such a niche kind of an area. So for people to have been so patient and been there through this fantastic journey. If I may just have one, and then if anyone's in a hurry to leave, most welcome. But Joshua, you spoke about music either obscuring or revealing. So there are some of us here who would describe ourselves as church musicians and adding to the worship. So my question is, related to music in worship, do you feel it could be a distraction, if at all? Well, it's two questions in one, so that's one. Could music be a distraction? And second, what should be the attitude of the musician and the worshipper? I mean, does it have to be the same? Can it differ? So, music a distraction, and attitudes of musicians and worshipper.
Well, the idea of music as a distraction starts with St. Augustine. It's in the Confessions, and he talks about how he can come to love music so much that it distracts him from worship, which I think can be solved in the musician's attitude, which is that if it's in complete service to the story and service to the worshipers, then by nature it won't be a distraction. But it means that the musician, of course, has to pay attention to the needs of the worshipers quite a bit. The worshiper has the luxury that the musician doesn't, which is the worshiper gets to worship, whereas the musician is a professional and has to preach in the music and carry the message of the church just as much as the preacher does, and of course with the preacher's help and direction. So unfortunately, we are servants in that sense. I hope that's the shortest answer I can give you, Robbie. That's a wonderful question for a 3-hour talk.
It's complex, yes.
Anyone else?
Thank you, Joshua. That was a wonderfully well constructed journey, very satisfying. And I'm so grateful that Reverend Avinash and Ravi Joshua had me speaking before you. Otherwise, frankly, I would have very little to say. Thank you. Coming to a question. Uh, Actually, I'd like to hear from you about what is the future of the Oratorio? Where does it go from here? Don't ask us that. Help us with your sense, because you are somebody who's been part of the journey. You've understood it. You carried us along with it. So I'd really appreciate your thoughts on it. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, one of the interesting things, since I've seen you all, I have been married. And I have married a woman who is a librettist who writes operas. And there's been if you had asked me 20 years ago, I would have said opera has more or less had its time and is done. And since then, there's been an incredible flourishing in new opera. So much so that I could meet someone who makes a living simply writing the words. And in that flourishing, Oratorio has been sort of dangling in the wind. It hasn't had its moment. But we can see with the popularity of the modern evangelical worship, that there's a hunger for the stories. And it's a hunger which is not necessarily filled in that style of preaching and song. So my feeling is that we have an opportunity to write new oratorio and refocus on the biblical stories. I've been fascinated to watch in my current parish as we have done a concentrated lectionary and done what's called an E100, an essential 100 stories of the Bible in the first half of this year. How engaged the congregation is and how new many of the stories are. Particularly in the West, the days of assuming that the biblical stories are commonly known are past. And so we have a great opportunity to make new music dramas, commission composers and librettists to refine them. And I think you'll see the very beginnings of that in the two Lloyd Webber, God help us, Jesus Christ Superstar and Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, and the play Godspell, which are little blips from the late 60s, early 70s, but I think predict a new form of reinvigorating all these great stories of our faith. Most people who learn Deborah for the first time are absolutely shocked to learn it. And I think most people would have a shocking and wonderful time with Jephthah or with Jacob and Esau or with Ruth and Naomi or with any of these great stories which are part of our faith. So I think we have the opportunity and all we have to do is make something of it.
Thank you. More power to your work.
Thank you.
Are there anyone else who would like to ask any questions or clarify or give their inputs? Okay, I think then we call it a day. Thank you. Thank you, Joshua, once again for this wonderful talk that you had. It's engaged completely, and we look forward for our partnership with the St. Thomas Cathedral, and we look forward for much more interaction with you. And yeah, and should we just end with a word of prayer? Then we can open up for any kind of fellowship after that. Heavenly Father, as we come close to the Holy Week, the time that you went on the cross for us, we ask you, Lord, to be with us and help us to come closer to you. We bring our brothers and sisters into your holy presence and ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.